And first off, I don't want to take credit for how great this PowerPoint looks because it was a template that someone made for a history class on like the German Revolution, and I just snatched that up immediately. So are there any Nick asked, are there any references for Phoenix's Communist Plus approach to share with other people? There are not, but I could probably like explain. Oh, never mind, there are. Yeah, Cam will be able to do that for you. Oh, there wasn't. So we're going to go through kind of 4 sections. The first is going to be an introduction talking about like why we learn dialectical materialism and how we should be learning it. This isn't just to like share our opinion, but motivation is really important for learning. It's a lot easier to learn something if you kind of understand why it's important versus I'm sure we've all tried to like learn something before that we had absolutely no desire to. We didn't understand the purpose of it, and you know that information just doesn't stick. Then we're going to go through theory, learn kind of how to use dialectical materialism to understand problems. And we say, I know at the start, we say that we're talking about solving problems, and here we're talking about understanding problems. But for complex problems, which are most of the problems we deal with, where there are a bunch of human like factors in there, there's a number of moving parts. Understanding the problem is 90% of solving. Being able to break it down, understand it, etc. Basically kind of leave a solution in your lab. Then we're going to move on to practice. We have a couple exercises, which actually have like nothing to do with politics, to kind of expand our horizons a little bit on using the tools that we went over in the previous section. And then the last part is going to be talking about where you can kind of go to learn more and expand, because kind of the idea behind this is that this is not just like a self-contained thing. Like this is kind of a first step, though I know it's not everyone here's first step, but it's like a step on the overall journey, and you kind of want to continue learning after that. So why we learn dialectical materialism and how we should be learning. Also, I want to say if you have a question at any point, feel free to like raise your hand or type stack in the chat, and then we can kind of just answer them as they come. So what is DiaMat? First, it's short for dialectical materialism, and there's a lot of shorthand will be a little bit of a theme here. But beyond being short for dialectical materialism, when we say it, it's also kind of a shorthand for the dialectical materialist method. It's a method, it's a tool, it's a way of doing things. And it's also kind of short for analysis that we do using this method. And that's really long, so you can understand why like it makes sense to just say dialectical materialism when we're talking about the analysis using this method, or why people just shorten it to DiaMat. But even if you are shortening it, we do want to kind of be aware that most of the time that's what we're talking about. That's the real meat of it, is the analysis that we do using this method. So it's a tool for understanding and solving problems, which again, for complex problems, understanding it is 90% of the difficulty. And once you really understand the problem, oftentimes the solution can just kind of fall into your lap. It is a skill that needs practice. This is something that I think the way that we normally are taught it and learn it gets kind of lost. With the kind of Marxist theory of history, you don't need to necessarily get good at that. Like you can know more or know less about it, but you either know it or you don't. But dialectical materialism is like a muscle that you need to practice, and you can be good or bad at it depending on how much effort you put into improving your skills with it. It's also, in my humble opinion, the most powerful weapon in the communist arsenal. Being able to very clearly understand a situation that seems kind of murky at first, and being able to break that down and communicate that clarity to everyone around you just dissolves a lot of the difficulties that we face. Not all of them, certainly. There's still a lot of hard work after that, because figuring out what to do is only half the battle. But this gets us on its own really close to understanding what it is that we have to do and putting us all on the same page. And this is cliche when I say it's a light to shine on class society's problems, not just the problem of class society itself. But I use the metaphor here. We have the little torch, because it is like a light where even if the people around you that you're struggling alongside aren't familiar with it, if you're able to use it and break down the situation and are able to articulate it in a clear way, you're able to bring that understanding to everyone else. So learning DiaMat the wrong way. So how we pick up communist theory is conditioned by a lot of factors. And so some of this will kind of explain and help you understand like the difference between the way we're normally learning it and others, but hopefully this can also kind of be helpful when you're thinking about your learning and studying in general. First off, it's conditioned by like what theory is actually like available for us to consume. In some cases, there's things that people haven't necessarily written anything on. People haven't tackled the subject, or there's certain mediums that things haven't been transferred to. I know I rely heavily on audiobooks. I still like do some reading as well, but the fact that I use audiobooks means that like my quote unquote reading has been heavily skewed towards what's available in audio format. Also, whether something's available for a particular audience, like not everyone is able to really just jump into Capital and read it straight away. It's kind of oriented towards a particular audience. And so if you look at the difference between Capital versus a lot of the stuff that Mao Zedong wrote that are oriented towards like party functionaries and just basically regular people with practical problems in front of them, that kind of lends a difference to like what theory like may be available to someone. And then there's also issues of selection, whether or not you're shown particular pieces, what ends up in like reading lists. How we're taught theory also plays a big role in like how we're conditioned. So framing, which includes like what this is supposed to be used for, either things that are explicitly shared with us, and then also pedagogy, which is just basically the way in which we're like learning things. And to kind of tie these in particular to dialectical materialism, you have framing where it may kind of be not talked about what it's being used for, or you may see it used in a given context, but not see it used in other contexts. And a difference in pedagogy might be what we're trying to do here, where there are some practical exercises versus just like reading a list of texts on a subject, which is not to say that's a bad way of learning, but each different way of learning kind of has different strengths and weaknesses for different subjects. And so how Western communists, or at least like English-speaking Western communists, learn and teach dialectical materialism kind of fails to answer a lot of key questions. And people who like are at this point pretty well versed in it may kind of be able to like nod their heads that they didn't really have some of these answers answered for a while, and that it really took a while to understand it. First off, like what does it do? How is it used? If you ask someone like, hey, what do you use dialectical materialism for? You very well might get an answer where they're like, hey, well, we use it because there's historical materialism, and basically list off things that other people figured out using dialectical materialism and things that you can understand better if you know dialectical materialism, but not things that like you don't need DiaMat to understand those things. You can just read them. What do you use it for? Which we've kind of already mentioned in our opinion is solving problems. How can I use dialectical materialism? This is a skill that needs practice. Then like you need opportunities to be using it. But if you don't know how to make use of it, you can't practice and you're not going to be able to learn it. And so in a way, if dialectical materialism was a like literal weapon rather than figuratively brought to some kind of literal class warfare, it would basically be bringing like display museum black powder muskets to like a modern firefight. Basically, and just ends up being just for show. We learn how to describe dialectical materialism a lot, but we don't really learn how to like make use of it. A lot of jargon and lack of instruction on how someone can go out and practice dialectical materialism makes it hard to retain the knowledge. And we can also develop a false sense of understanding from that, where if we believe we understand it and we're not really inclined to like go further and question like, okay, do we actually understand it? And this is where you may see people on the internet throwing around words like dialectical and material into arguments just wherever they can fit them in order to kind of sound smarter and intimidate people who like don't know that they're not using those words properly in the first place. And also we sometimes treat dialectical materialism like it can be used to understand everything, which in a way it kind of can, but it can't on its own. This is one tool that needs to be combined with other tools. Like if you're using dialectical materialism to figure out a problem related to relationships, you see in one of our examples, you kind of also need to know a little bit about relationships and communication beyond that. So this is something that needs to be kind of combined with other study. And we fail to think about how it applies beyond the examples we're given. It like honestly took me a while to like really realize that dialectical materialism, like we knew it's supposed to be this universal thing, but it really took me a while to grasp the fact that like, yeah, you can use this for things that have absolutely nothing to do with politics or revolution. So we want to learn DiaMat the right way. And communist and socialist societies tend to do it differently. For example, the focus is on how to apply it to your own work to solve problems. So education also about education beyond dialectical materialism, learning other things is often required in like China and Vietnam to enable cadre to like better understand and make use of DiaMat. So like Vietnam, I know is very much focused on using dialectical materialism as like a practical way to understand what's going on. And this conversation actually owes a lot to Vietnamese communists in particular, and then also Chinese comrades. If you like look at a lot of their kind of more recent documents, systems theory is a big part of what they teach their cadre, like learning how to understand situations in order to solve problems is a big part of what they do. And we need to learn from each other's successes. And that's definitely something they've been pretty successful with. So I think that's something that we should learn from. So our objective here is to give you a basic understanding of what DiaMat is, what it does, how it's kind of properly used, how you personally can use DiaMat, and how you can keep learning. So we're going to go over the foundations of like what analysis is in general. So that's kind of a word that's thrown around where we all have like a general sense of it, but we want to give you a little bit better sense of like what it is that you're actually doing there. So we're doing a DiaMat analysis. Talk about what dialectical and materialist actually mean. I find myself having all the time to preface like, hey, I'll explain what I mean when I say the word dialectical, because it really, in many cases, often is just like a buzzword that people throw around. We'll talk about what contradictions are and some features about contradictions that are pretty important. We'll talk about some fundamental principles for applying this method. We'll also give you a few basic kind of tools to be using right off the bat. Here's one of them we'll go over, which are like called categories. And that's something that generally doesn't come up right away for Western communists, but is something that's kind of part of the big part of like the curriculum for like Vietnamese communists, for example. And we'll practice together with a few exercises. And then also kind of afterwards throughout our life on our own using some of the kind of roadmap we lay out. And we're going to teach things a little bit differently. We're going to try to teach it kind of closer to the way that or at least to the spirit of like how our Vietnamese and Chinese comrades tend to teach it. And so now it's time for theory. For this, again, this is not a self-contained like unit, so you're not necessarily expected to remember everything we're going to go over here. We are going to be throwing a lot out there, but the point is to give you some stuff that will stick, that you'll be able to like use in the exercises, but also to kind of prime you for additional learning. So that way, like you may not, when we mention like what an antagonistic contradiction is, that may completely leave your head by the time that we're done with this. But when you're later reading through things and you see someone talk about it again, it'll kind of be a little bit familiar and it'll be easier to remember that. This would also be a good time if you have pen and paper and want to take notes. We won't be going back to these slides like when we're doing the practice, because we'll kind of have the exercise itself up. So if you're able to write things down, that can kind of be a reference sheet for you. So first off, analysis is something that you do. It is an action. It's an action with a material basis. You are taking information that's out there in the world and you are reorganizing it, putting it together to kind of come up with something new. We also, it's another shorthand. Analysis is kind of also short for analysis, where you're breaking things apart, and synthesis, where you're coming together with something new. But again, we're not necessarily going to be nitpicking, we'll just say it's like a shorthand people use, like when we say analysis, we mean that we're kind of breaking the situation down, but then also synthesizing something new out of it. The general goal, like we said, is to take things in, recombine it, and we want new insights from the existing information that we find. So a couple kind of end products of analysis that we might kind of want to, that we might be doing analysis, apologies, that we might be doing analysis in order to get our judgments of fact, theories / models of things in general, like a model of like what the state is and how it operates. Theories and models of specific things like maybe the American state right now, or any kind of thing. Also, we kind of develop theories of like cause and effect, like what happened because of some event and how did some event come about. I kind of use this, what I call this workbench model of analysis, where it is just kind of like a metaphor for understanding like how the different pieces play in. So your workbench that you're working on is your working memory. That's kind of where you do the most of your thinking. Storage is kind of your short-term and long-term memory, the things that you've learned, the things that you've picked up elsewhere. Your kind of materials, raw materials you might use are the information you have, background knowledge, and kind of knowledge of current events that relate to what it is that you're actually trying to analyze. So raw materials you can think of as like the new information. You can think of like assumptions as like prefabricated parts, where you may be putting something together from parts, because we're always carrying some kind of assumptions into our analysis. And then tools are basically guiding questions or templates of questions, frameworks for asking questions, different kind of lenses or angles or perspectives that we might use to look at something. And so it's really kind of all of this that we're using when we conduct analysis. We have the stuff from our storage that we're pulling in, we have the materials that are in front of us, we have the tools that we're bringing to the table, and it's really not just what we know and what we think and what we believe, it's about what we're bringing to that workbench and making use of. And so successfully using that workbench requires making sure you've got all of the right information that you need. You may want to make sure that you're not missing anything important. You don't want to bring in things that are incorrect, and you don't want to bring in like unnecessary information. You want to make sure that you've got all of the right tools for the job. And so some of these, like if anyone has seen like I think they're called like SWOT diagrams or SWOT matrices, they're basically like a 2x2 set of four squares where it's like strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's basically literally just like a series of questions, but those series of questions that you kind of have in advance are a tool that you use to understand a situation in a particular way. And there's many different ways you can do that. You want to make sure that you're actually using the tools that you have and that you're using them properly. So now let's get to understanding like what it is when we throw around the word materialist. So what makes an analysis materialist? So first, this may sound a little controversial, but hold on for a second. Basically, you can scrap most of what you've heard about like the history of materialism and idealism when it comes to this. That's important to know from a historical perspective. It definitely does help inform this. This is something that I think a communist should learn. But when it comes to analysis, things have kind of moved on a little bit since then, to where if we're really just caught up in this debate between materialism and idealism as like Marx was having it, it tends to kind of distract us from some other areas. So it kind of means two different things today, one of which is kind of the philosophy of physicalism, like including like matter, energy, etc., all being out there. But it also kind of relates to what's actually brought into our analysis. Like, are we looking at the concrete situation versus like the situation that we're kind of conceptualizing? Idealism is also, at this point, it's part of the reason why I say it's not as important for analysis specifically, though I do think it's important to learn, is idealism as it was as a philosophy during Marx's time is not really present today. It's not incredibly relevant. Most people are either materialist, or probably the most common is a dualist, where they recognize there's a real world but think there's also some other kind of world over it. but the kinds of idealist errors that someone might make are incredibly relevant. For example, one of the most common would be kind of taking your assumption of what you think the situation is and kind of substituting that for the actual situation, not investigating, assuming the way you think things are is the way things are, or is the way things are. And so that even if you are consciously, like philosophically, a materialist, you can still make that idealist error. And so that's kind of when it comes specifically to analysis, how we kind of want to think about that and why the specific philosophical debate is not as important here. So being a materialist in this case is less about the concrete beliefs you have and more about the method. In other words, it's what you put onto your workbench and what you bring to it rather than what you have in storage. You can believe that you're a materialist all you want, fully believe, like, and answer that question honestly and say, yes, I am a materialist. But if you're not bringing the assumptions of a materialist to your workbench, it doesn't matter if you are an idealist or a materialist, your analysis can still end up being idealist. So a couple things that a materialist assumes. There's an objective reality that we can learn about, and we learn about it through engaging with it. The best method is basically the scientific method, or in other words, trial and error. We interact with the world, see that if it responded to the way that we think it would respond. If not, we assume that there was something about our understanding that was wrong and we adjust it. We also assume that the proof is in the pudding. Like if you try something out and it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. If you try something out that you didn't think was going to work and it does, then it works. We really look to reality as the kind of final measure of what's true or what's accurate or what's useful, and try to stay away from like wishful thinking. We also assume, and again, this is not something we just know in the back of our heads, but we're bringing to our analysis, that it's very easy to confuse your theory about reality for reality itself. So we kind of always want to be on guard for that. And then, yeah, so those are kind of some basic assumptions. What materialism is, what makes a materialist, there's far more about here. This is an oversimplification, but hopefully it's good enough to kind of inform our understanding. So what makes an analysis dialectical? So it's easy to give a definition for. It's a little harder to actually like define in a way that is very clear to understand. And it's, I think, even harder to be dialectical when you're doing this. I think the best way to understand dialectical is to contrast it with metaphysical. Mao kind of talks about these as two different opposing worldviews, each kind of having like their own class background that they represent. So for dialectical, you want to think things that are connected to each other, constantly changing each other through the interactions that they have with each other. You want to be thinking about a past that leads to a present, and that's currently leading to a future. You want to think about relationships between things, and you want to think about, as a metaphor, kind of studying nature out in the wild. For metaphysical, you want to think isolated, unchanging things that have always existed the way that they do. There's no past, no future, and only the present. You want to think about things that are just in themselves and don't have relationships with other things. And you want to think about studying nature in a test tube. A lot of these are obviously things that people like. There are probably very few people who actually, if you ask them, hey, is there no past or future, and like it's just now, or do things never change? No, like it's a common saying that the only things that don't change are death and taxes. But again, it's not about your beliefs, it's about what you're bringing to the workbench, because analysis is something that you do. And so if you're not thinking about past and the future, if you're not thinking about relationships, or at least asking whether or not those are important things to think about for whatever's in front of you, you end up having this metaphysical worldview that even if you don't think the world is unchanging and just a bunch of things by themselves, your analysis will act as if that's the case. So another thing that's important for understanding dialectics is, what is a contradiction? And it kind of gets at what we might call the basic law of dialectics, is the unity of opposites. A contradiction is kind of where you have two things that are, you can think about it as a relationship between two things that are distinct from each other, but can't be separated. Okay. So you may think like two sides of a coin, or hot and cold. Like those are things that are very clearly distinct, but you can't really like break them apart from each other. So what a contradiction is not necessarily, though it can be, it's not necessarily a relationship of literal opposites or logical opposites. Like hot is the opposite of cold, but like the proletariat isn't necessarily the logical opposite of bourgeoisie. Like there's kind of a different relationship there than a strictly not proletariat. They're not necessarily pairs of things whose existence literally contradicts each other, and they're not necessarily always a conflict. In a lot of cases, they are. That's class contradictions or conflicts that are contradictions that have conflicts, but you also have contradictions where you have things where you can think of it more being in conversation with each other, or things that are kind of have like a creative tension between them. So some examples that you might see are pressed classes versus suppressor classes, hot and cold, slow and fast, and form and substance. So what overall should you know about contradictions? First off, I want to actually stop real quick and check in. Does anyone have any questions, or also like, do I need to go slower? Any kind of feedback, I guess?
Actually, I got one. So is a contradiction something where like it doesn't contradict, like it can't exist without the other? Like it's not, a contradiction isn't something that just is the opposite of each other. It's the opposite of each other, but they also can't exist without each other.
Yeah, that's definitely, like, I think that more accurately describes, they're not necessarily the opposite of each other, but with a contradiction, in a lot of cases, you have two things that really, they're in a relationship with each other, and they really can't exist without that relationship. I can go slower on the slides as well. So the next part is, what should you know about contradictions? Now, this is a part where you may want to take notes, but also, again, this is more of a roadmap about the kinds of things that are important to understand when it comes to contradictions, but you don't necessarily have to know all of these right now. These are just the things that you want to know at some point. But as much of this as you're able to retain and that you're able to use in the exercises when we get there, the better off you'll be. But again, if you can't, there's absolutely no worries. So first, you kind of want to understand like the difference between internal and external contradictions. Kind of the idea behind dialectical materialism is that everything is kind of made up of and is driven, and it's kind of changes through contradictions. And so you have contradictions between one thing and then another thing, but also each of these things has contradictions inside of them that kind of make up what that thing is. Another important distinction is kind of what is often called like the basis of change, which happens generally from internal contradictions, and the conditions of change, which happen with external contradictions. Now, Mao gave what has got to be like one of my favorite examples of just like a vivid, clear explanation of like a concept like this. One of the examples he gave is that given the right conditions, you can turn an egg into a chicken, but there's no conditions you can put a stone into that will turn it into a chicken. It's because the egg has that basis of change already, based on like its internal contradictions, what it's made up of, how those things interact with each other. And then when you have certain external conditions applied to it, like the right heat, then it goes forward and develops. You also want to think about universal and particular contradictions. So one way you can think of that is kind of the contradiction between our class and the bourgeoisie, the ruling class in general, but you might also have particular contradictions, like the contradiction between a given boss and a given set of workers in a specific workplace. There's also a difference between principal contradictions and secondary contradictions. All kinds of contradictions that happen all contribute different amounts to how something is changing or developing. And generally, one of them is going to have an outsized influence. And whichever one is primarily driving things, that one's going to be what we call the principal contradiction. Everything else is secondary. There's also Each contradiction obviously is made up of two things. We can kind of call those aspects of a contradiction. And there's always like a principal aspect, and then there's a secondary aspect. And then these can change over time. It's not necessarily, dialectics is not like a metaphysical world where how we talked about everything is static and unchanging. You have things that tend to be the principal aspect, but sometimes that can switch around. So one of the examples might be theory and practice are two things that are in contradiction with each other. Again, they're not necessarily opposites, but they're very distinct from each other, but also can't really be separated. And practice, for the most part, is the principal aspect. It's through interacting with the world that we learn, and we can really only theorize about it once we've gone out and done something practical and gotten some kind of interaction that we can work with. But there are times where it switches around. And as Lenin put it, there's no revolutionary practice without revolutionary theory. So I know he did not say that way, and I know I like butchered that quotation, but you get the gist. There are also what are called antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. So an antagonistic contradiction is something where you have two things that are just completely at loggerheads, and this is not going to resolve like necessarily like peacefully. So it could be in the case of like a conflict between groups of people, but also another example that's used is you might have two chemicals that are, or two states that are in kind of like an antagonistic contradiction with each other within like I think the example was like a hand grenade where you have, it's going to erupt and you have one side or another basically like went out. Versus non-antagonistic contradictions are things where that's not the case. You can have things that live in harmony. For example, if you think about the contradiction between form and substance, so like, for example, the substance and the material they're made out of versus the form that those materials are put into. Obviously, it's not going to be one or the other winning out. They're in constant kind of conversation with each other. They both interact back and forth, but it's not antagonistic. You can also think of stable and unstable contradictions, which include contradictions that where you may have like the principal aspect be pretty much the same over time versus you might have contradictions where it really goes back and forth a lot more. So what counts? Oh, and then also, as I mentioned, what counts as a principal aspect can change. What counts as a primary contradiction at a given point may change. Based on,
and I saw a lot of like it was like a nest.
Oh wow!
And I threw him in the trash, and then all these flies came out flying, and I sprayed them with the ones that are there.
Okay.
Where was I? Yeah, and like what counts as like the principal contradiction in a given situation can change. For example, in class society, we think of class as like the primary contradiction when we're looking at global problems. But that was not always the primary contradiction because we had a classless society at some point. And then if you're dealing with like a particular issue that has nothing to do with class dynamics, it's between two working class people. Sure, it may play in there, but it may not be like the primary contradiction. We'll see like examples of that later. With a lot of like physics, like class might not be the contradiction that you're primarily looking at if you're looking at some kind of problem related to like building something. So this is kind of a quotation which I think gets at like what it is that we're trying to do, what it is that you do with dialectical materialism. Lenin meant just this when he said that the most essential thing in Marxism, the living soul of Marxism, is the concrete analysis of concrete conditions. We want to, that's kind of what makes something material, that's what makes something dialectical, is really by sticking to the actual situation that's happening on the ground, looking at what we can concretely see, looking at the actual relationships that are taking place. The closer we are to reality, it only makes sense that the closer our analysis is going to be at the truth. So this is kind of the part where, again, you might want to take notes. Kind of tying all this together about like what dialectical materialism is. We can think of it as, it's a lot deeper than this, but we can think of it as a fundamental set of assumptions that you bring to your workbench when you're going on and doing an analysis. These are basically just several points. It's kind of the contents of the Dialectical and Historical Materialism, I think is the name. Someone can correct me on that, by Joseph Stalin. Kind of his main points about it condensed. So first, one of the assumptions you want to make sure is actively, again, it's brought to your workbench, it's part of your process, that everything in the world is connected, and that when change happens, it comes from the interaction between these connected things. Everything in the world is a constant state of motion, or in a constant state of motion and change. It always has been and always will be. Things are the way they are now because there was motion and change in the past that led to this moment. And then we're also not going to be stuck here. There's some kind of trajectory forward that we're going. The way that change tends to happen in the world is that you have quantitative changes, the kinds of things that you can measure, things you might be able to put a number on, leading to qualitative changes, which are like much bigger shifts in kind of the overall character of things. The better way to explain this is just through an example. The common example here is heating up water. You have a quantitative change where the number of the degrees are increasing, the temperature is increasing, the heat is increasing. And then all of a sudden, when you hit 212 degrees, flips over, and then all of a sudden things change radically. And you have the form of water change from a liquid to a gas. That's kind of how a lot of changes, that's how change in general works, is you have these kind of slower quantitative changes, then all of a sudden you have a rapid change to a different way of doing things or a different way of being. Contradictions exist everywhere in the world, and everything that exists is in contradiction with other things. We live in the real world and only the real world. There's not some other external world of ideas that are floating around. Plato was entirely wrong when he imagined there's some kind of realm out there where there's things in our world aren't really red, they're kind of embodying this ideal red. No, we're here in the real world, and that's the way that we're going to be thinking about it when we're doing our analysis. There is an objective reality. We can learn about it through interaction and experimentation. I'll leave this up for a second, just because I know I spoke a little bit fast at points to give everyone kind of time if you are taking notes, or even if you just need some time to digest it. Also, if anyone has any questions. Also, before we move on, I want to thank everyone for coming. This was kind of just initially like we were rehosting this educational that we had that people wanted to, in the club, like wanted to see, and kind of shared it a little bit, hoping that maybe like one or two comrades might want to come and see and provide just kind of feedback about this different approach. And a lot more people than one or two people showed up. So I want to thank all of you for coming and seeing this. All right, move on. So now we're going to give you some basic tools that you can use like right away. Again, you don't necessarily have to remember all of these. It might be helpful to remember just one, and you can record these as you're going through so that when you have the notes on this. And this is one last section before we actually get to the exercises. And thank you for coming, Michael. So some of the tools we're going to go over is categories or dialectical categories, this concept of synchronic versus diachronic analysis. And the words there aren't as important. You don't need to remember those terms at all. Just the distinction and kind of understanding it will be helpful on its own. Diagramming, and then thresholds. So dialectical categories are an extremely general kind of fundamental concept that describes patterns that you see in a lot of contradictions. So you kind of want to think of them as like a category of contradictions of the same type. It tells you what to look for. If you're thinking about a category like form and substance, or internal and external, and you're aware of that category, and you come to a situation, you can think about, okay, what's internal and what's external? What's the form of this thing that I'm looking at, and what's kind of the substance and the material that makes it up? Kind of gives you, prods you to like looking for where those contradictions might lie. And then it also is gives you some general knowledge that may apply to a particular situation. So if you understand some characteristics about internal versus external contradictions in general, you can bring that to the table when you're studying a particular contradiction. Categories can also contain other categories as you start to think less generally and more specifically. You don't need to, like, it doesn't need to get too confusing. All you need to know is just not be weirded out if things are there. This isn't like some thing that was gifted from the heavens. It's just kind of patterns that people have recognized and put a name on, basically. So here's some examples. You have these categories called the general or universality. Yeah, that actually, so I've heard them mostly talked about, like, used specifically just with the term categories. But yeah, they also kind of represent a contradiction themselves. Like, you have universal versus particular. The dialectical categories refer to kind of the universal nature of a certain handful of contradictions, or the general characteristic of a certain handful of contradictions that fits some pattern of internal, external, and the ones we'll go through here. So you have form and substance is a very common one. It's something that I make use of a lot. And a couple different ways that this can be is you may be thinking about more specific things about, like, the material of an object versus the shape of an object and how these things feed back into each other. The material that an object has is going to affect what shape you can put it into. And then the shape that you put it into can kind of affect some of the properties of the material. For example, there are certain shapes that can handle pressure and handle, like, carry more weight than other shapes. And so you have this back and forth there. Another example might be the objects being arranged versus the way that they're arranged. For the cases of patterns, you have the pattern itself versus the elements being patterned. So you can think of this as, like, if you have ones and zeros, or you replace them with A's and B's, and you have, like, the same pattern between whether you're using A's and B's or ones and zeros would kind of be the first part, and then whether or not you're using the first of the two options or second throughout would kind of be the other half of that contradiction. Some other ones are space and time, continuity and rupture. As things change, you have things that are completely different from the past versus things that carry on. Internal and external is another one that you can probably find a lot of use out of when coming to problems. Just asking, okay, is there, what here is, can I think of as internal versus external? This one I didn't necessarily have, like, a good name for, but the contradictions between, like, the abstract class of something and concrete instances. And so what I mean by that is, like, the concept of a chair versus, like, the particular chair that, like, you're sitting on. That being, like, a specific instance of a chair. Reality and a perception is another big one. You'll sometimes hear this referred to as, like, essence and phenomena. And this is important to recognize as a contradiction, because it's not just, like, reality is true and then perception is, like, just what you think. But the way people perceive things affects how they interact in the world and ultimately changes reality. So there is some kind of back and forth there. Then the perceptions have to be based on reality to some degree, because that's what they're looking at. Cause and effect is another one. And then this is one that I haven't typically seen, like, listed as a category of contradiction, but it's something that you'll see talked about a lot in Marxist texts, especially this is kind of where class contradictions come in, is a contradiction between two different needs or two different interests. These can be the contradiction between one class of people and another class of people, or it could be a contradiction between two needs that, like, you yourself have, like the need to get some sleep versus the need to have some time of the day that's not devoted to work and chores to enjoy yourself. These two needs are kind of in contradiction with each other. And if someone can drop in the chat, like, how am I doing on pacing for everyone? If there's any thumbs up or thumbs down. So this one, synchronic versus diachronic analysis, again, you literally, it's not going to affect your life at all if you don't remember these particular terms and which one matches up with which. But it's just thinking about this distinction will help. So the synchronic analysis is you're analyzing something or several things at a particular moment in time, and kind of like a snapshot. versus diachronic is analyzing how something or several things have changed over time. And one example that I've got of familiar with, that I'm kind of a linguistics nerd, is you have certain kinds of analysis. We'll look at all the features of a language and what those features do, or how the grammar of language A is different from the grammar of language B. But that's a synchronic analysis. You're just looking at a snapshot of how things are right now. Diachronic analysis would be looking at like how Latin changed into Spanish, etc., and how things move over time. And so knowing these techniques and these specific kinds of analysis is far less important than just understanding that there's a distinction between those two ways of looking at things. That in itself will get you pretty far, because thinking about time is in half the battle. When people are like learning about dialectical materialism, especially in kind of, again, the English-speaking Western communist world, this is probably the part that is kind of like our weakest area, is a lot of our analysis forgets about this element of time, that things not only develop to a particular way, but that things are moving in a particular trajectory. So we're not necessarily, we're strategizing. We're not just thinking about creating a strategy for the way things are now. We have to think about a strategy for the way things are now. And then step two has to account for the changes that will happen when we finish step one. So that metaphysical worldview, that kind of studying nature in a test tube view that we talked about, teaches us more or less that synchronic analysis is really the only kind of analysis. That's really kind of the core of what a metaphysical analysis is basically taking this snapshot and not seeing any of the interactions that are happening and just seeing things the way they are now and forgetting how they came to be and how they might change in the future. So generally speaking, you want to make sure to look at things diachronically if possible. And if you are looking at things synchronically just at one time, that's totally fine. It's not a bad way of looking at things, but you just want to be aware that you're just looking at a snapshot and not confuse it for like the entirety of understanding what it is that you're looking at. And so some ways to think about time that come up include development and trajectory, thinking about the course of the way that something is changing, the way that someone's life or the way that an organization is changing over time. And you also want to think about like the timing of interactions. You may have it where, I think one of the examples is how that we would deal with racism. We can't just assume that, okay, we finished the contradiction related to class, and then when we're done with that, then we can start dealing with racism. These things, these two systems of white supremacy and capitalism move back and forth and interact back and forth. And so kind of like a knot, where you have one part is really tying down like another part. You can't necessarily pull on either, like on any part of a knot, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not a knot expert, so I'm struggling with the vocabulary here. But like how with the knot, you can't just pull on one side and have it come out unless you tied it that way. You kind of have to pull on one part of the knot a little bit, and then it loosens up the other part, and then you pull that a little bit and you go back and forth. That would be kind of like another important way to think about time. Diagramming is another very valuable tool. So our brains are heavily adapted for visual processing, and we can make use of that by taking the things that are in our brain and putting them on paper. We can also use these kind of visual metaphors when we're familiar with like drawing them a lot to help us think about things. And so relationship diagrams are really well suited to dialectical analysis for this reason. You have things that are related, you have the relationship that exists between them, and then you talk about like the nature of the relationship. So this is just kind of one I took off the internet. So you see how you have all of the different things on here. You have the things, the way they're related, and then they've marked down like how these things relate. So as the current date increases, the remaining time you have decreases. As your deadline increases or gets further away in time, you have more remaining time. As your remaining time increases, then you have less schedule pressure, et cetera. You can kind of like look through and see pretty easily like how all these things fit together. But if you try to do it like just in your head without anything on paper, that's really hard to fit all that in your work. Last thing is thresholds are a really helpful thing to be thinking about. Again, this is something where you don't necessarily need to know a specific technique. Just being aware that this is something to look for is really helpful. So we know that quantitative change turns into qualitative change. It's one of our assumptions that we're bringing to our workbench. But when does that actually happen? So we can think about a threshold as the point at which something occurs, some kind of change. We can think of it as the boiling point. We can think of it as a breaking point. So like we know that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius. We talk about the straw that broke the camel's back, but we want to know how many straws will break the camel's back. Like that sounds like silly because it's of course a metaphor, but that's basically the question that we're asking. We also know that like where there is some kind of qualitative change happening, or some qualitative change that might happen, either in some physical system with a problem we're dealing with, or with like a political situation, there's some threshold that's associated with it, where there's something that's increasing or decreasing, and when it hits a certain point, then you have that big noticeable change. And so some questions that we might ask is, in a given situation, what is the threshold that we're looking at? If we're doing cooking, we may have exact numbers. But if we're doing something more complex, like organizing, we probably won't have access to like specific numbers. So we can ask like, what might the threshold be, and kind of ballpark it. And also, we may not even know what to look for, but we can ask ourselves, like, how do we know like whether or not that threshold has been crossed in the first place? Is there some characteristic of what's going on that tells us that, hey, this thing changed? This is something that also kind of comes up in cooking, the Maillard reaction, which I will definitely tell you about shortly. You see your food start to brown when it has crossed over this thing. So you don't necessarily know what the temperature is, but you see like a sign that that threshold is crossed. All right, stop here. The next part is going to be moving into like the actual practical exercises. I'm excited to see what you guys make of this. But before we move on, I want to make sure that we have time to answer any like questions. If you'd like me to go back to a certain point in the slide, real quick, let me know as well. All right, seems like everything is good to go. So we can move forward. So this first exercise is brainstorming. Well, actually, first, before we see what it is that you're signing up for, if you can put in the chat whether like you'd like to be called on. I may, just to keep things moving, ask people like for their particular opinion if like no one is going forward. A few things. One, I want to make sure that like I'm not putting someone on the spot who feels like very uncomfortable about it. So please like let me know if you're willing to be a volunteer in those situations. And the second with these, again, this is about practice. This is not like a history test where you need to get the right answers. Whether or not you get the right answer here is really unimportant. The point here is to practice. The point here is to kind of build that muscle memory, metaphorically speaking, and get used to thinking this way, because it's something that does take, it seems like a lot until you start to practice it, and some of this starts to come second nature, and then it's a little bit easier. It takes less time. So no one here willing to be a volunteer? So Tom is willing. Jason? Awesome. Well, whether or not, Cam, you were willing, I was going to probably still put you on the spot anyway, if need be. Red is willing. Anton, all right. So you can move on. So for this, even if you aren't going to be like sharing your answers, again, the answer itself is unimportant. It's the process of going through it. So please, please, please try to like work on this like on your own. So for brainstorming, this is the list of dialectical categories that we had. And right now we want to come up with some kind of example of a contradiction that falls under one of these categories. And you want to describe what are the two aspects of that contradiction and how they relate to each other. For this, it doesn't matter if it's in the wrong category. Because again, the categories here are like a tool. As long as it kind of alerts you to a contradiction, you're doing well enough for now. You don't have to get too in depth, so I can start off with an example. So say with a community, you might have you might have a contradiction between a relationship, I guess, between two different contradictions. So you might have the relationship between one community and the community that's next door. And then within that community, you may have different groupings of people who kind of all have different interests and play off of each other. And if we're looking at how those internal politics play with that external politics, that would be like an internal external contradiction. But you can also obviously think of these as not having anything to do with politics at all. And I would actually encourage people to kind of stay away from revolutionary politics for these, just to kind of like broaden your horizons and expand the way that you can use this. So another example that I used earlier that falls into this is under the category of needs and interests, having a need to sleep and then a need to actually like be awake to enjoy your day when you're not working and not doing chores. So feel free to stack on this question, and if no one stacks for a little while, I will turn to our list of volunteers. All right, Tom.
Yeah, this one's for, I guess, space and time. Kind of harkens back to the hot and cold example. The idea of like cold doesn't exist, it's just the absence of heat. So it's like a potentially good way of recognizing relationships and contradictions.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Anyone else on stack? Cam?
Yeah, I think this one goes under reality and perception. Would be the perception of what the United States represents versus what it actually does. As we all know, with the US being the terrible capitalist hellscape that we live in, we don't really live to the American dream that the United States tries to tell people abroad. So I think it's just a really interesting contradiction going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also a great example of how those are actually like contradictions, because people's perception of what's going on or what this country does impacts like how they act with things. That's kind of how false consciousness arises, and false consciousness is not like non-existent. It's a real thing that has real impacts. Anton?
Under the category of continuity and rupture, I think a great example of that is actually in the life and work of Charles Darwin and Darwinism and his theories of natural selection and evolution. Charles Darwin obviously wasn't the first biologist, and he obviously wasn't the last, but his work represented a continuity with the biologists who had gone before him, who had, tried to classify animals and plants and try and understand the natural world around them. But the idea of natural selection and evolution obviously represented a rupture with the thinking of the time in the fields of biology and the natural sciences. He was able to take his work and, break with the existing ways of thinking that, obviously, and, quote unquote modern Christian European society obviously placed a high emphasis on the natural's relationship to God or the divine, and he was able to break with some of those categories and with some of those ways of thinking and create a new field of natural sciences that obviously had a relationship and continued the work of people who had gone before him, but ultimately represents a fundamental break in the way that the natural sciences were understood at the time.
That's also a great example, and like you can probably find, not probably, like you can find with all like areas of thought, fields of study, you can find like that same pattern there wherever you're looking. Jason?
Yeah, I was thinking of a kind of a fruit as it like the contradiction of kind of ripe and rotten or life and death. As I don't know which category this exactly would go under, maybe a couple different ones really. But as time is progressing, the contradiction of life and death is looking different or ripe and rotten, sometimes, well, eventually death will always win, as we know, for this fruit especially, but there are times when it's thriving completely, when it's super ripe and it's the perfect time to eat it, but then, that other contradiction will start showing itself a lot more as time goes on.
Absolutely. Thank you, especially because like that shows like, I think that's a good example of like how we can be using dialectical materialism to think about things that are just more like mundane and in the world around us, because it's really like those things that are going to help us like when we're trying to like practice. So next exercise, actually, first off, I want to see if there's anyone else who, we won't go for volunteers, but I'll give it a minute if anyone else wants to stack specifically to come up with examples of contradictions that you can kind of like find just around your household or like in your daily life. Elias?
Yeah, so you can actually go on Marxist.org onto the glossary, and if you go to the T section, you find Tao, which is the Taoist philosophy from Lao Tzu, who was an ancient Chinese philosopher, and it explains the dialectical relationship between things, referencing the yin yang symbol as well, because that symbol is a representation of contradiction and unity of opposites and existence reflected within the other of each other. That's the actual meaning of the symbol. As a pop culture thing, we see it everywhere, but that's what its actual meaning is. So I just wanted to point that one out too.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, like I've used that example myself, like the yin yang symbol of how the two sides are like interconnected and they're also kind of contained in each other is a good way of how this works. But I am going to push you a little bit here. Where can you find, and it doesn't have to be like a very straightforward example, but where can you find like this kind of yin yang dynamic somewhere like in your house right now, whether at this exact moment or like in general in daily life?
Yeah, my two cats. One of them is a lighter color. One of them is dark. Their two colors define each other's existence.
Yeah, no, that may seem like a silly example, but no, like the two colors having like a contradiction with each other is like an actual thing, and in many cases like that may not be like very important, but there are also cases where like like if you're doing like graphic design, like the contradiction between colors is like something that you do want to be concerned with.
Yeah, like there's so many examples within the common world, tall versus short, for example. If everyone there's this one example, sorry to go on, but there's this one example. If you've seen The Incredibles, Syndro at some point says, if everyone's special, no one is. So it's kind of interesting to see him want to do that, and it's like a almost nihilistic approach that he took, but it's a kids movie.
Yeah. James, and then we will move on to the next exercise.
I'm gonna make a joke now, but Syndro is Hegel, because he's talking about negation of the negation rather than actually participating in a materialist dialectic. Anyway, so I think what I was thinking of was it was a internal and external, internal and external contradiction. But there was like I was thinking of something specific. Now I'm walking over to do my laundry. It was so if you have like an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is generally, if you think about it as a closed system, like it's generally a system which, oh, sorry, that is my alarm. It's a system which generally functions on their internal contradictions, on things being in conflict with one another, like animals and their prey, or with like, photosynthesis itself being a process that is determined through contradictions of chemicals reacting with sunlight and all that. Then you have the external contradictions of like climate change and like human action that itself kind of is internal to some ecosystems, but on a grander scale and often existing like transnationally, so they're not like bound to specific biospheres and whatnot. So like it's things that are still like functioning together. There's a lot of like non-antagonistic contradictions that exist within it and that have to exist. But then you have like the external contradiction of humans and how we affect the environment and you know our own ecosystem kind of internally and externally. So yeah.
So, I'm gonna push you a little bit more towards the domestic realm here. Very briefly, how would the kind of internal external contradictions you're talking about, like what would they be in the case of like someone's garden?
What was the last thing you said, Lucas? Sorry.
Like kind of pushing this more to like the just domestic realm of things. How are these kind of internal and external contradictions for an ecosystem be for like someone's garden?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Yes. So I mean, if you're talking about just like, yeah, like putting it down to a garden specifically, like you have the internal contradictions of like, you know, the plants reacting with the nutrients they need to grow and develop. But then you also have the external contradictions of like bees coming from other gardens or other pollinators coming from other gardens and then pollinating across across those gardens, bringing seeds and whatnot to help propagate you know, other specific or pollinating the plants within said garden. So like, you know, it doesn't have to be like the external contradiction does not have to be antagonistic. It can also be a, gosh, I'm forgetting the word, but yeah, it could be the non-antagonistic contradiction. So
Gotcha. Yeah, no, absolutely. So for Red. Yeah. So under needs or interest, a company needing maximum productivity and wanting minimal cost, kind of trying to balance those two needs. It's a good succinct example. So John asked, is continuity and rupture quantity and quality? Not necessarily. Quantity and quality is kind of also itself like another category that you can think of about things. But continuity and rupture is basically the continuity of a situation would be the things that are the same as it was previously, and the rupture would be the break from it. So the continuity includes things that are basically like, I see where you're like seeing the connection between the two. So that rupture itself would be basically a qualitative change that happened from like some kind of quantitative change previously. And then the continuity would be either no change at all, or would be like quantitative change that's still just a quantitative change and hasn't hit some threshold. So this next one, we're not gonna stack, we're just gonna drop them in the chat. And don't worry about whether or not you have the right answer. And also don't worry about whether or not you can come up with an answer in the first place. So we have this list of dialectical categories again, and I would like you to kind of come up with a potential category that isn't on the list. And again, if you can't come up with something, that's totally fine. Most of these are like took work to really understand, where people were looking at a ton of different contradictions over the course of their life and noticing a pattern and putting a name on it. And your patterns, your categories don't have to be as large as this. They could be like very specific to a case where you can think of maybe a couple contradictions that fall under some label. And if it's wrong, that's fine. The point is not to come up with a correct answer. The point is just to like spend a little time thinking about like going through the process of thinking through some contradictions and what are you seeing between them. So give it a couple minutes and feel free, just as you come up with them, drop them in the chat. And I would encourage people who have not spoken yet as well to make sure that you're dropping something in there, whether or not it's right or wrong. Here, like I may call out some good examples, but like I'm not going to correct people who are like wrong. And if I'm not shouting you out, that doesn't mean you're incorrect. But again, the primary purpose here is just to kind of get the juices flowing and practice this. Red started us off with victory and defeat. That's, I think, a great example of the kind of category. So John asks, how is this exercise different than naming opposing forces? Here we want to think about like more, what are some other general types of categories? So previously we were trying to think of like, what's an example of a contradiction between something internal and something external, or what's a contradiction, a situation where we see a contradiction between reality and perception. We right now are trying to think of other types of contradictions that basically we could have put in that list, if that makes sense. So like Red's example of like victory and defeat, there may be in a bunch of different situations how victory and defeat go through. So yeah, professional and personal is good. All of these are great so far. Here's I realize I probably will read them out in case anyone is audio only. Yeah, that makes sense. We're still figuring out kind of the administrative part of sharing this information. So victory and defeat was a good one. Professional and personal, absolutely. Form and essence, like the US supposedly has freedoms because we have nominal rights or like some essence of it. But we also have the highest number of prisoners per capita in the total population. So there's definitely, that's a contradiction that could kind of fall into that category. Cam gave the example of society and community versus the individual. And so it's not that broad, but that's what he was thinking. First off, I do think it is a great example of a potential category of contradictions. But even if it wasn't broad, which I think it is, coming up with a narrow category is totally fine. Most of the stuff we're going to come up with, like we're just regular people who are starting to do this for the first time in some cases. And like for the rest of us, this is not necessarily something that's our full-time job. Like we're not limited. So most of the stuff is going to be very narrow as we're kind of coming up with examples. Action and inaction is a good one. Opportunity and cost, also great. Is there anyone who hasn't shared who wants to drop one in the chat? Again, if you are not comfortable, no pressure. I just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to kind of be participating. That also is a contradiction in itself, is trying to balance making sure that people are able to participate, but also the need to like make sure people are like comfortable not being like forced into things. Vibration and air in terms of carrying sound waves, there's definitely like contradiction there. And if you change that to like, for example, like vibration and like medium, there's a ton of different things, ton of different types of contradictions that would fall into that category. Reform and revolution is definitely a category. Like there's the reform and revolution we think of, but there's also reform and revolution in other areas. Like the Industrial Revolution was not just a change in how industry and production was done. It was like a wholesale revolution. even like our culture when it comes to the things that will need to change for climate change, that's also a question of reform or revolution. Like, are there just minor changes we need to make to our culture and consumption habits in relation to land, or does it need like a full-blown revolution? All right, move on. So now these are going to be more specific situations. Oh, here's another one. You mentioned vibration versus air is interesting because I think there has to be a medium to produce a vibration like water, air or water. Exactly, yeah. That's one of those, I think that's a great category. So these next two are going to be more practical things. Some of these situations, you may understand the solution to this problem right away, just from other information you have or other experience. But again, because the point here is not necessarily to get the right answer, it's to practice. I would rather people be unable to figure out kind of how to articulate what the answer is and describe the problem in terms of dialectical materialism and not come up with an answer, but still try, than to understand the answer right away and share it, but not really know how to like think about it dialectically. And part of the reason that I'm doing this is that a lot of these like mundane examples that you already know the answer to are some of the best things to practice on and think about how you might think about something dialectically, because you'll know whether or not you're getting it right. Well, let's get to our third exercise. So imagine that you are making pork loins with a balsamic reduction. You wanted to do it all in one pan, and you realized that you might have done things wrong. You made your sauce first and then started to cook the pork in the same pan. The pork is cooked through, but its surface looks soft and gray instead of the brown and charred like you kind of used to at a restaurant. And the question that you want to figure out is what might have gone wrong. So here are some things. Here's some things you know. So you want to explain what happened using what you've learned today, and if possible, provide a solution. And so here's some things to know. First, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The Maillard reaction, or browning, happens between 280 and 330 degrees Fahrenheit. The Maillard reaction is this one. You absolutely want that sweet, sweet Maillard reaction to happen. The Maillard reaction happens a lot, especially with meat, but it can also happen with vegetables. Like if you get it on leeks, it's completely changes the game. Where things start to brown and it breaks down the substance of like whatever it is that you're cooking, and generally just makes it taste better. Like you want that Maillard reaction that gets you that nice stuff at the bottom of the pan that you end up like putting back into your sauce. I can't remember the name of it, but it's the thing that you deglaze for. But so you absolutely want this in your cooking. You want that browning to happen. So give people a minute to take a look at this. And again, even if you're not able to really describe the entire situation, or you're not able to come up with a solution for it, that's fine, as long as you're able to explain part of it. And even if your answer overlaps with someone else's, I would rather you have the opportunity to go ahead and share that. Where the volunteers was. One second. All right, so Nia pointed out that the best course of action would be to start over and focus on the temperature in which the meat was cooked, because that seems to be where the recipe went wrong. And she's like, this is the best that she can provide right now, which first off, I want to shout out, this is a great example of like how to be engaging with this, even if you can't figure out all of it from a dialectical like perspective. Trying to do as much as you can is exactly what you should be doing. There's a lot of situations that you're not going to be able to figure out entirely with dialectics, but trying to use these tools will help you get a certain distance, and other tools that you have and are able to use will kind of get you the rest of the way. Yeah, so the conversation continued. Cooked enough to boil the liquid, but not high enough to achieve the Maillard reaction. Exactly, and I will ask you in a second if you'd like to basically be on stack to answer, to try to explain that in dialectical terms. Cam also mentioned the order in which the food was being cooked. Shania said exactly, it's kind of like her point. And so, yeah, we can go back. So Anton, if you would like to try to explain what you said in terms of some of the stuff we've learned today. You're muted if you are trying to talk right now. So this means the internal contradiction of the liquid. The heat there was enough to boil, but it was not enough for the Maillard reaction. Exactly. The order of operations, times of the order of operations might need to be checked against another recipe or two. Thermometer to know exactly what the temp the meat is at would be useful too. Agreed and agreed, and that's definitely the order of operations here. Like I said, the pork needs to be cooked first before the sauce so that the Maillard reaction can take place. Crispy bits can be developed at the bottom of the pan, then the sauce liquids can be reinserted to create a reduction, which is a contradiction between the liquid at room temperature versus a pan with a crusted content at a very high temperature, causing it to be reduced into a sauce after the reaction, forming a thicker new substance. Absolutely, you want that. God, it is bothering me. Fond, there we go. Fond is the name of the like the crispy bits of meat that end up on the bottom, which you absolutely want in your sauce. And so, yeah, no, you definitely want that in your balsamic reduction. Everyone's definitely on the right track here. Everyone's so far seems like to be able to like use these tools to kind of talk about different situations. If someone who is not weighed in so far can weigh in, and I'm going to give you a hint. What you're saying is probably going to overlap with other people's, but how would the concept, the tool that we learned of thresholds play into this? Also, while we're waiting for someone to jump in, where people are talking about order of operations is that's kind of goes back to that synchronic diachronic thing, that is looking at things diachronically. And even if we don't remember the name, which again doesn't really do anything for us if we do remember the name, thinking about things in those terms is like really one of the most undervalued parts of dialectically. John's solution is the pork should never have been bought. I should have recognized the obvious of me never cooking it correctly. The contradiction of my cooking skills versus my ambition. No, that's it's funny that that's also a great example of contradictions. Like I know we're trying to like steer more to domestic, but like with CPUSA Phoenix, like there are things that we want to be doing. Like there are things we want to accomplish. But what we want to accomplish versus where we're at now and what we're capable of doing, there is a strong contradiction between that, which we're hoping talks like this can help us resolve. Nia said the turning point should be raised after the sauce has been cooked. Yeah, no, turning point is also a great metaphor for that. And then, yeah, that's exactly what should be happen. It's after you kind of done one portion, then you change the temperature to do the other. All right, move on, and we're going to talk about relationship issues. And so this is actually probably like one of my go-to, not this specific exercise, but relationships are probably one of my go-to examples for uses that dialectical materialism has outside of politics. And like it definitely makes me feel like too much of a nerd when I'm talking about how I'm bringing dialectical materialism into my Tom joked in there arguing with my fiance, babe, let's try DiaMat. But actually it is kind of like very helpful in terms of like you have these messy issues that are going on, and it helps you kind of personally like think about things in a different way and understand a problem is like kind of two different needs, perhaps like needing to be disentangled and thinking about it as not and asking whether or not this really is an antagonistic contradiction or if there's some solution we're not thinking of. Things like that, understanding it as a thing that's going on between you rather than the issue being someone else, definitely helps with your relationship far more than treating the other person like they're the problem. Which in some cases they can be, obviously. But if you're in a healthy relationship, you want to keep it healthy. So Alex and Bailey are a couple that is having an argument. Alex is a publisher, a local radical news organization. They gather news about what's going on in their community that normal newspapers won't report on. So if there's some kind of strike that's going, there's some kind of environmental issue that's not getting coverage, those are the kinds of things that they talk about. Bailey says that Alex spends too much time on the project. Because whenever they want to hang out with Alex needs to leave for a meeting that Bailey didn't know about or had forgotten about. So Alex says that this is something they're passionate about and that they don't have meetings every day that they plan out. And they feel like Bailey wants them to give up on this passion because they still have plenty of time to spend with each other. So we want to try to analyze this problem in terms of some of the contradictions that might be in play and maybe suggest some solutions. I think that this Tom is on stack.
Yeah, I think there could be like a therapeutic approach and like a pragmatic one. Therapeutic one would be recognizing contradictions or assumptions that each person is saying or feeling different things. Alex is passionate and probably wants to focus on their independence, while Bailey might have some fears around maybe abandonment or being second place. And like a pragmatic solution could be having a shared calendar where they both can see each other's events and commitments and things like that and put time on that calendar for each other that they can both see.
Absolutely. And so you did do something that I didn't ask for, and I want to highlight that because that's a good thing. One of the ways that you kind of used it that I didn't intend in this like particular exercise is not only to use contradictions to think about like to explain like the issues that are going on. You kind of used a potential like category of contradictions as a way of thinking about two potential solutions that can work and be in conversation with each other. That's, I think, an excellent example of like how you can make use of categories when you're thinking about solutions to problems as well. Help you think about like what kinds of things, what kinds of contradictions there are. Maybe you can use that to figure out what kinds of things can be in conversation with each other and build off of each other. John on stack. And then Nia has a response I'll read off.
So especially in relationships, we have to consider antagonistic versus non-antagonistic, struggle in this. So I'm not necessarily providing a solution, but being able to recognize what is antagonistic and what isn't antagonistic and what leads you down to either way. So, what Tom was suggesting is very obviously, or hopefully non-antagonistic. Maybe one of them is very against calendars. I don't know. But, being able to recognize these things are very helpful, especially in relationships.
Absolutely. And first I want to point out like if you don't have a solution, it's fine to not jump to a solution, because just talking about the problem and trying to understand it and doing this like we're doing now, like collectively working with other people, that is in a sense solving the problem, or at least doing the work of solving the problem. And that recognizing the difference between antagonistic and non-antagonistic is also great here. Like there are certain things where someone may have to may not be willing to compromise at a certain point. You also have relationships where there are genuinely bad relationships that are like unsafe or unhealthy or abusive to be in. And that would be an antagonistic contradiction where you don't necessarily want to find a way to fix and you should be leaving. So Nia pointed out I think a situation with more communication would be in order because the focus does seem to be in different places. So I think a situation where they both feel heard would be ideal for them to be able to progress in the situation that they're in, and that we're all more or less saying the same thing. Absolutely, no. Communication was exactly the solution that I thought of for this particular situation. And yeah, I think we are all kind of like saying the same thing, but again, the point here is to practice, but also like having this kind of like back and forth conversation about the same thing kind of helps us narrow down some of the finer points. And I think is a good sign, hopefully, that we're all kind of converging on the same solution, because like we'll have situations in real life where it may seem obvious to us that the problem is a certain way or that a certain thing needs to be done. And if we're all kind of converging to the same thing, that tells us that we're probably on the right track. It's like technically, even though like I wrote this example, like in this lesson than the previous session, people came up with answers that were like well beyond like what I was thinking of and are better than the solutions I had for it. So this isn't, a lot of these things are not necessarily something that one person can do. And through the conversation with each other and getting on the same page ends up being like very, very helpful. So we are almost at the end. And thank you. This was like not timed or anything in advance. So I want to thank everyone. I do also like want to thank people who like were not able to continue here. And we will be able to like send the recording to people, to whoever wants it. But I also want to thank everyone who's been here, like who's still here so far. I know this has been a while and I hope that it's been pretty helpful so far. So we want to talk about like what to do going forward. Because again, this is just kind of like a first step or another step if you're already like a little familiar, but it's just a step in kind of the broader roadmap of getting better at this. So here's what to do. So first, obviously, keep learning more. This should not be the end of your way of learning and practicing with dialectical materialism. Some of you may be going straight to like reading some text about it. Some of you may have a video on that you're listening to in the background while you're doing chores. Other people may just spend some time thinking about like things they already know about and thinking about how they can like talk about it in dialectical terms. But as long as you're continuing to learn, continuing to practice, even if it's not dialectical materialism, learning other things that you can bring into these analyses is going to be helpful. You want to finish the fundamentals. So a lot of the stuff that we talked about they're not all necessarily going to stick in your head right now. Continuing with the fundamentals, which we'll go over like some really like keywords that will help you, will really get you all the way. Like it's really the fundamentals that help out. So first you want to read, watch, or listen to good examples of dialectical materialist thinking and understanding what it is that they're doing. I personally think Mao is a great example of this. You could see how he uses dialectical materialism to break down these problems, even if he's not explicitly saying that he's using it. Looking to people who are like modern thinkers that you may not even necessarily think of as theorists, but people who are kind of giving analysis on things and see like where are you actually seeing this dialectical materialism come in and where are you not, and that can kind of help you build a sense. Something that's kind of maybe a little counterintuitive, but I think actually makes some sense is so if you look at Mao's work, his more quote unquote boring works are actually really good examples of this. He has some reports on like what happened in different villages with different efforts. But also like his military campaign reports are great, mainly because as far as I know, like we're not in a current like hot war right now. So none of us are working with military problems. So being able to look at someone who is dealing with a problem in a domain that's completely like what we're not familiar with and kind of seeing with the common language we have with them of dialectical materialism, what are they doing? Like, how can we understand their problem based on like these terms that we kind of know, well, we may not understand like the military part of it, kind of seeing that can help. One second. So Aaron has an example scenario for previous. One second. Here's another good one. So in the case that one of the factors affecting this relationship dynamics reaches a certain point, eventually, for example, like these are my day-to-day needs for how I spend time. Quantitatively, it may mean a qualitative, or may it like lead to a qualitative change in what we do in the relationship, like whether we live together or what we decide to do in joint versus individual pursuits or goals. Yeah, no, that's a great way to like bring those particular points that we learned in. So I've alluded to this a lot. You want to find ways to practice dialectical thinking, especially in areas of your life that have nothing to do with politics. First off, it'll be helpful for like your mental health if like when you're studying for this, it's not always like thinking about the current situation that we're in. But it also helps you be creative when you do think about things politically, because you have a wider sense of what dialectical materialism is and how you can use it. So thinking about like how we can like talk about maybe things in like your job related to that, or thinking about cooking or your relationship or whatever else, just being able to bring just little bits of what we learned today and what you will continue to learn in will help you immensely. You want to practice with the tools that you have so far. You want to find more tools to make use of. There are more tools that have been developed for dialectical materialist analysis. And then there are also tools that have nothing to do with this that you will also find very helpful in combination with this stuff. Like, for example, I mentioned the SWOT analysis chart could be pretty helpful. There is a 0% chance I was actually going to put one of those in a PowerPoint. It would just feel too much like, it would make me feel too much like a business major. No offense if there are business majors here, but that's just not me. But that would be an example of another tool that like may be useful, and you may find use of it, like combining it with what we have here. So what to read or watch. So these, I have a couple examples, and I'm going to kind of bold the examples where if you're like, okay, where do I start? So first, Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Stalin is great work. It really explains things like pretty clearly. Those fundamental assumptions that I got are literally just the kind of the headings from his chapters about dialectics and materialism, basically condensed and reworded a little bit. On Practice by Mao is great. It really introduces you to the Marxist way of understanding the world, or like how we think we understand the world. This idea that we do it through engaging, and it kind of helps you put a lot of this in context and understand like analysis, understand what it is that you're doing. On Contradiction by Mao, this one I am highlighting. This is one of the things I was thinking of when I said finish the fundamentals. On Contradiction talks about various kinds of contradictions using many different examples, very vivid examples, and tells you like how to understand things. It literally is just a book about how to understand things, and gives you plenty of tools, plenty of questions to ask, because that's all like real analytical tools are, is just like questions more or less. That is definitely a good one. Materialism and the Dialectical Method by Maurice Cornforth. Personally, I haven't finished this yet, but it's people who I know are very well versed in this and are very like good at dialectical materialist analysis. All recommend it. And the sections that I have read so far as I've gotten, really clarified for me what makes dialectical materialism dialectical versus like kind of quote unquote mechanical materialism. Dialectical Materialism by Alexander Spirkin. And this, I believe, actually like might have won a like award for like textbooks and OEEs, but in particular, chapter 2, the system of categories and philosophical thought, talks about some of the categories that we listed and can kind of give you some general knowledge on them that you can bring to particular contradictions. And then here, this is partially where our debt to our Vietnamese comrades comes from. There's a series on YouTube by Luna Oi, who is a Vietnamese communist, How to Think Like a Vietnamese Commie. And what she did is basically take what she learned growing up in Vietnam, going to school, being educated in Marxism, Leninism through their school system, and taking what she learned about dialectical materialism and putting it into the English language, so that way we can actually like have access to this. and she just recently finished translating one of their textbooks into English. That's going to be available pretty soon, and I am incredibly excited for it. But also she goes over categories in here. It's like a 3-part series. This, if you're like not immediately jumping into work, if you have like another thing on your reading list, this would probably be like one of my first recommendations to like listen to, and then probably followed up by like reading on contradictions. So how to practice: observe how the fundamental assumptions that we talked about are kind of reflected in reality. Just take note when you see quantitative and qualitative changes take place. Take note when you kind of realize that some change that you saw actually has like a quantitative change happening and then a qualitative change when you didn't necessarily realize it. Think of examples of contradictions, just coming up with them off the top of your head like we did in that exercise, immensely helpful. Analyze contradictions in your own life, even ones where you kind of already understand the problem, probably especially those, because then you know whether or not you're on the right track already. And when you come across a problem, try to understand it with a dialectical materialist analysis. You may not be able to solve the problem that way. It may be overkill in some situations, but just trying it out gets your brain used to working with these kinds of things. And eventually some of the situations where it feels like overkill, because you're really putting a lot of mental thought into something that doesn't require a lot of it, eventually won't feel like that, because again, these things become second nature, just like muscle memory, and it takes you less time and feels less like overkill to just apply this, because you just kind of to do this. Yeah, we went over kind of an introduction, why we learn about this, how we should be learning it, went over some theory, add some practice to it, did some exercises, and then talked about like how we can all kind of move forward after this. We went over some of our tools, thinking about categories, thinking about this distinction between synchronic and diachronic, or between snapshots and timelines. Talk about diagramming. Seriously, draw stuff out. It is incredibly helpful in like thinking through problems and planning. And then thresholds are another good thing that we kind of introduced to. And that's it. Yeah, no. Thank you, everyone. This was like unexpected to have this many people. And so I'm really excited for all the feedback, and I'm also really excited that there are like this many people who know a little bit more about dialectical materialism, or introduced to it for the first time, or have like a new appreciation for it. So the more that happens, I'm really excited for that, because it's a beautiful way of looking at the world. So Tom mentioned some supplemental sources for DiaMat, the Revolutions podcast. They have an episode on historical materialism, and then the Rev Left radio podcast, Historical Materialism, Marxist Theory of History. I would endorse both of those. Also, I'm going to be kind of shocked if the Revolutions guy doesn't turn out to be a communist at some point, because I have to say that that episode was one of the best explanations of a lot of like Marxist fundamentals. Like the labor theory of value part was a little bit off, but I feel like that always is with everyone. But when he was talking about like historical materialism and kind of some of the parts of political economy, it was like a better explanation than I've heard from like a lot of Marxists. He has this concept that he calls like the tree of production, where he talks about how these X of production and Y of production actually relate to each other. So definitely recommend that. And then so we'll be super thankful if you can, thankful if any reference recommendations can be emailed forwarded, keeping notes regardless. All right, I will try to then take some of the references that were in the PowerPoint, the references that were mentioned here. And also I can send out, if I can figure out how to do it, attach this recording and send this out to everyone. Again, thank you for coming. If you have any feedback at all on this in terms of like ways that this can improve, changes to be made, aside from like the obvious like needing practice to like work out the kinks, I'm very open to like hearing the feedback there, because this site is like a little bit different than like the way it's normally taught. And I want to make sure that it's useful and helpful for everyone. Yeah, thank you for coming, everyone. Have a great night.
Have a great night, everyone.